You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 10th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio.
The people of Europe have spoken, but how much sense did it make? The United States leans harder on Israel to call off operations in Gaza, and an exciting new way to make air travel even more tedious. I'm Andrew Mueller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Mueller. My guests Marta, Lorimer and Dalziel will discuss today's big stories, and we'll hear from the journalist Brian Groom about his new book, Calculating the Amount That Manchester Has to Answer For. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I am joined today by Marta Lorimer, Fellow in European Politics at the London School of Economics, and by Dalziel, the writer, broadcaster and Russia analyst. Hello to you both.
Hello. Good evening.
We will shortly be talking about the EU elections, spoiler alert, and rather helpfully, one of you has just been to what we now think of here in the United Kingdom as Europe, the separate, the other, the Foggin Channel continent cut off, and one of you is about to go there. Stephen, we will start. Either one of you's just been and one of you's just going. Stephen, you're just going. You're going to Portugal.
I'm going to Portugal very soon, yes. But it's not one of these exciting journalists chasing politicians trip or whatever. It's I'm going on a thing called a holiday. Going to Porto and then hiring a car, driving up north. I've never been there for my sins. So I understand that the National Park is something very special, which we'll be spending a few days in. And then back to Porto, which I also understand is lovely. So I'm very much looking forward to it.
Well, helpfully, this very programme is being produced by a real live Portuguese person. She's waving from the production booth now, whom you can solicit for travel tips afterwards.
I shall indeed. Thank you, Carlotta.
And Marta, you have been in the continent so recently that you did actually arrive here with your bags.
Yes, exactly. I was in Paris. I left London yesterday morning at 10:30 and I arrived.
It was that bad, was it?
It was, it's the fourth time I go to Paris this year, and I think there's only so much Paris that I can take.
Okay, so you're over it at this point.
I am over it.
Okay, disgruntled Parisians, please address your complaints directly to Marta, not Monocle as an organisation. We're very fond of Paris. In fact, I think we've just done a whole big book about Paris and France, which we're hoping people will buy. Marta.
Yeah, buy the book and then don't go there.
What took you to Paris other than the train, obviously?
Well, yes, of course, it was a Eurostar. No, I was taking part in an electoral night in Paris, in the offices of independent media Mediapart. And just as I was talking about the far right in Europe, I was kindly interrupted by the presenter to let me know that they had to interrupt me because Emmanuel Macron had just announced that he was calling new elections. So I didn't have this in my bingo cards, but here we are. It's the beauty of live TV.
Well, that tees up our first item nicely, which is, of course, the EU elections, the results of which are now by and large in. As was widely anticipated before polls opened, it went broadly well for the continent's phalanxes of far-right seethers. Various stripes of hyper-conservative finished first in France, Italy, Austria and the Netherlands, and second in Romania and Germany. But it turned out to be sort of surprisingly non-disastrous for centre-left parties who did pretty well in Spain, Italy, Hungary and France. The largest single bloc will remain, however, the centre-ish European People's Party, and EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen seems slightly likelier than not to keep her job. Stephen, all that being the case, did anything much actually change? What did we learn, etc.?
I would say that the headline grabber, of course, was the aforementioned announcement by President Macron of French elections in 3 weeks' time. I mean, we thought that we were shocked here when Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, called an election for 6 weeks from the time he called it.
But the French, they've always got to one-up the British.
Well, they've certainly they've one-upped us on that one. I just, I did follow. I wasn't taking part in the live debate, but I mean, I followed what was going on. And yes, as you say, the prediction was that the right would do well, and they've done pretty well. I do find it deeply worrying that, you can get in particularly in countries, in Germany and Italy, countries which have had a genuine experience in the last 100 years of fascism. And to hear in the days leading up to the elections, a report from Italy in which someone was calling out to a crowd, we take our ideas from Adolf Hitler, and the crowd going, yay! I find that desperately worrying. Are the young not studying history these days?
Well, the depressing analysis is that, yes, they are studying it and they're rather enjoying it. Marta, on that subject of President Macron's snap election, and to be clear, he is not putting his own job on the table. This is a parliamentary election, not a presidential election, and it is astounding and yet strangely unsurprising how many commentators have failed to make that distinction in the last 24 hours. Do we understand why he's actually doing this? Is this as straightforward as him staring down the French public, gesturing towards National Rally and saying, go ahead, elect these clowns, I dare you?
Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated than that.
I hoped so.
That seems to be the first analysis, which is, okay, this is what you want, then go ahead, you can have it. And then, you're going to learn. No, this seems to be a very simplistic analysis. What is probably more likely is that Macron is thinking about his own political party's future. So there's two ways to read this. Either he's trying to have an election where he gets a clear majority of some kind, because right now he doesn't have one, and that has made his life impossible. Or he basically tries to get rid of all the other parties that are not the National Rally and finish his project of basically recreating the French political system around a center that is basically him and everyone else. There's, of course, the third theory, which is that he is trying to create some sort of large alliance with the sensible voices, again, to try and get some kind of measures through, expecting that people will ally with him. But I find it very hard to persuade people that you have told for 7 years that you didn't want to work with, to convince them that, actually, no, I've changed my mind, maybe we can do something together.
Well, on a related question, Stephen, and going back to the far-right upsurge in the EU election, there was, and I think still is, this idea, possibly complacent, possibly hubristic, floating around that it doesn't really matter anyway. These people are all completely loopy. They're badly organised. They hate each other far more than they hate anybody else. They will fight like ferrets in a sack and never actually accomplish anything, which is, of course, the optimistic analysis relatively. But I cannot help be reminded that it's not so very long since then Prime Minister of this country, David Cameron, dismissed UKIP, the UK Independence Party, as, and I quote, fruitcakes, loonies and closet racists, and look how that went.
Yeah, indeed. This idea that the parties on the right might actually hate each other and hate each other more than anyone else is not so surprising in a way. Many years ago at the BBC, I produced a piece where I had to interview the leader of a communist party in Great Britain, and at the end I just said, now, just to make sure I've got this right, so you are the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Great Britain? No, he said. I mean, it was almost like Monty Python, Life of Brian, and split us. And he said, we're the British Communist Party. We don't have anything to do with them. So there is actually a lot to this. That often
the only people we hate more than the bourgeois capitalists are,
the far right, yeah.
Yes. Are our fellow communists. There's a weird recalibration going on, though, it strikes me, Marta, that for all that we have had in this country Brexit, and for all that we have had in the United States reasonably recently Trumpism, it is not at all unimaginable that out the other side of elections in this country and in the United States, we might see, weirdly, ironically for all that, the United Kingdom and the United States being governed by relatively sensible centre-leftists, while Europe goes a bit weird.
Now, let's not overstate the extent to which Europe is going weird. I mean, the EPP, so the Europe's People's Party, which is the sensible centre-right conservatives mostly, they actually gained more seats than they had before, partially because in Hungary they lost Fidesz, but they have gotten this new movement created by a former Fidesz person. So the In Europe, the biggest group is still the center-right, center-left, center. Now, the problem is that center-left, center-right, and center have started copying some of the ideas of the far right. So we're not necessarily seeing a far right that is in power. They are still, in most places, kept a little bit in the margins or participating in, say, government coalitions of some kind. But the problem is that the mainstream is radicalizing, so we are seeing a shift of the center of politics to the right.
Just finally on this one, Stephen, and it is an eternal and I suspect probably unsolvable problem, and it also factored very much into Brexit and into Trumpism, that does, and going back to what Marta was saying, that, the far right, the far right success can be easily overstated. Does the media make a continual mistake in overstating their successes and overstating their influence and being overly excited to cover them because they are sort of exciting and weird and lurid, and you can't really cover them without, inter alia amplifying their message?
There is that, but at the same time, I'm not even going to mention the name of a certain far-right politician in this country who's been given far too much media coverage lately, so he's not going to get it on this programme. But I still find the very idea that people can be attracted to very right-wing views, being very anti-immigrant, for example, blaming them for, we haven't got any jobs because of them and this sort of thing, is worrying. And you do just have to look back over the last 100 years of European history and say, hey, this is worrying. It's something we should be concerned about. I find another bright spark, though, is not to be a total pessimist. One of my favourite parts of Europe is Scandinavia, and the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, they all returned pretty sort of left of centre members for the European Parliament. So that is encouraging. So it's not happening everywhere. But I do think, I agree that the media can make too much of it, but I think it would be even worse for it to be this move to the right to be ignored.
Well, to Gaza now, and to ongoing efforts to organise, encourage or impose some sort of ceasefire in it. The pro-ceasefire tendency may have been given a boost by the weekend's resignation from Israel's war cabinet of Benny Gantz, former IDF Chief of Staff, Defence Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. On the other hand, Gantz's departure may have strengthened the hand within Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's circle of the hardcore hawks. Nevertheless, the United States plans to seek support for its ceasefire deal in the shape of a resolution from the UN Security Council, which, unlike the repeated demands from the UN General Assembly, would theoretically be legally binding. Also, while all this is going on, Marta, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, is back in the Middle East. But this UN Security Council resolution, would it make much difference to anything?
I doubt so. I'm not 100% sure how responsive to the international community Benjamin Netanyahu is, actually. So I don't really know how UN intervention would really help at this stage.
Is there a possible logic to this, Stephen, as has been suggested, that the US is just as subtly as it dares trying to make Netanyahu's position completely impossible and help nudge him out of office? I mean, it is no great secret that Biden and Netanyahu cannot stand each other personally, and certainly no great secret that the longer this has gone on, the more obviously exasperated Biden has got, both for his own domestic political reasons and others. Is there possibly something to that?
I think there probably is. As you say, there is the personal animosity. Of course, Biden has to be a little bit careful because there is a very strong Israeli lobby in the United States. But I think even some of them are saying, that Israel's taking a sledgehammer to crack a nut in Gaza. This extraordinary story at the weekend where 4 Israeli hostages are freed. Great, yes, that's good news. But, and okay, we're taking the Palestinian side figures, but, something like 235 Palestinians died in the mission to free these hostages. That, again, when you weigh it up, yes, of course they want to get the hostages back, but, this is not 235 members of Hamas, I am guessing. The
Israeli sources have acknowledged that there were casualties and many of them were civilian. They dispute the numbers, but no one disputes that there were casualties.
But it is yet another example of, again, that sledgehammer cracking a nut, I would suggest. I mean, I know it's terrible. But I think when we're talking about these things, we tend to lose sight of the fact that back to the 7th of October, and yes, it was a terrible thing that happened, but where was Israeli security? And I think that Netanyahu, one of the things, his behaviour since then seems to be doing everything to try and cover that up, almost as saying, look, we're going to smash Hamas. We're actually, I think he's on a recruitment campaign for Hamas with what he's doing. But how was this allowed to happen in the first place? And I think that because it's gone on for so long, that question has rather been pushed to the side. But I think it's very important.
Gantz's abdication from the war cabinet has been positioned as his frustration with the fact that there does not seem to be any plan at all for what is going to become of Gaza, who is going to govern it, who is going to rebuild it. Part of the United States peace plan, not all of the details of which have been released, but as I understand it, is that there will be some sort of framework involved for reconstruction of Gaza. But is it possible to imagine at this point who is actually going to want anything to do with that?
It's very hard, isn't it? Because it's a classic problem that you have whenever you have to reconstruct after a war, is how do you first of all bring together a society that has been completely torn apart or that has been completely destroyed. It's quite a traumatic experience. So it is going to be very hard to do anything about it, and it is going to be extremely hard to find anyone who wants to have anything to do with this.
And just finally on this, is part of this formulation going to necessitate being, Stephen, trying to find a way that both Israel and Hamas can kind of claim that they've won here, that Israel will be able to say that, and Israel has been saying, and it's doubtless the case, that they have severely limited Hamas's capacities, certainly as a military organisation, and for Hamas at least to be able to claim we still sort of exist?
In an ideal world, but we don't live in an ideal world, unfortunately. I just this fact that Netanyahu doesn't seem to have a plan, an end game. Just get rid of Hamas and keep bombing them and attacking them till what's left. The Palestinian people are a people. I don't think I'm being revolutionary if I say that I feel that they have a right to a homeland as well. But of course, Netanyahu doesn't accept that. I can't see where this one is going unless the Americans, I think a lot depends on the Americans, unless they really do put pressure on. If Netanyahu somewhere in his government is brought down, but I mean, there's an awful lot of, going back to what we were saying in the first story, there's an awful lot of right-wingers in Israel too, who of course see the destruction of Hamas and the no land for the Palestinians as being what should be. So it's a circle, I think, that cannot be squared.
Well, let's move along. And this weekend, representatives of at least 90 countries, including 45 or so heads of state and or government, will gather in Switzerland, specifically at the Bergenstock Resort on the shores of Lake Lucerne. The gathering is the first summit on peace in Ukraine, though it is fair to say that the overwhelming majority of attendees already want peace in Ukraine, if on Ukraine's terms. Russia wasn't invited, though has clarified that it wouldn't have gone anyway, so there. China isn't coming either, and Brazil and Saudi Arabia are among other prominent no-shows. Marta, first of all, reassure me here, speaking as someone who is actually going to this thing, which I am, tell me what I should be looking forward to. Is there much point to this expedition, do you think?
I mean, you're going to Switzerland.
Well, that's always nice.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to Switzerland. What better place to be talking about peace than a neutral country?
But for the summit itself, do you think there's actually much chance of it accomplishing anything?
I don't think so. I'm going to be absolutely honest with you. I don't really think that the summit is going to achieve anything but perhaps a nice brainstorm and maybe some proposals. But it doesn't sound like it's the actual beginning of any kind of process.
Because part of the problem that President Zelensky has at this point, Stephen, and I say this as somebody who is broadly sympathetic to the thing he's been saying for the last 2 years and change, is that he doesn't actually have anything else much to say beyond that, i.e. that Russia should get out of Ukraine, Ukraine should be restored to its 1991 borders and left alone.
Indeed, but you and I were discussing this not so long ago, and I was being I think very optimistic, and I will find a glimmer of optimism, in fact, and link it to the previous story again, because we were saying how difficult it would be to find countries, corporations or whoever to help rebuild Gaza at some point. Well, of course, Ukraine is going to need an awful lot of rebuilding as well.
But that's going to be a much, much less politically fraught undertaking, I would have thought.
It is, but I would have thought that this, and maybe I'm giving you a tip for conversations that when you're roving around with your microphone, it may just be that opportunity also for conversations on the sidelines about, how are we going to deal with this? There is already the question of using seized Russian assets, which seems to be ever more popular, and I think at some point will happen, which I think is just totally justifiable too. But just a gathering of representatives of 90 countries, that I think is a possibility, that looking ahead, yes, we support the Ukrainian peace plan, which basically says the Russians have got to get out of our country, which I think is fair enough. But then what happens? And so those who perhaps are a bit more forward-thinking might start having those conversations about how they can help Ukraine once the end does come to rebuild, because there's just so much rebuilding that needs to be done.
Marta, President Macron is going. I mean, granted, for him, that's not a huge undertaking. It's just down the street. But he will certainly see this as an opportunity, won't he? Especially in the absence of US President Joe Biden. This is where Macron gets to reassert his fairly transparent idea that, I'm kind of the default leader of the free world, at least on this side of the Atlantic.
Absolutely. I think it was very interesting. There was a recent poll that showed that the one political figure that most Europeans have actually heard of is Emmanuel Macron. Whether they like him or not is a different story. But he is certainly going to try and assert his position in international affairs, because he knows that this is historically what has helped him gain legitimacy at home. Now, the problem is that he is going to be at a summit as a president who has just lost an election quite badly, not himself, but his government, his political movement. So he will be weakened, certainly. And I think that puts him in a bit of a difficult position.
I mean, he can at least console himself that he's not weakened as much as Olaf Scholz.
Yes, absolutely. He can still go there and say, no, I'm still the face of Europe. We're all good. I did better than you. But still, it's not going to be looking great for him. But I think going forward, if he does end up without any kind of majority in Parliament, so with another hung Parliament or with another party in government, being an international relation figurehead is pretty much the French president's main job.
And, of course, he is the one who has put forward the idea of, to use that rather cliched phrase, boots on the ground, that French military trainers could go into Ukraine, which has certainly got them upset in Moscow. But that idea seems to be gaining some traction amongst others. So I'm sure that is something that also will be discussed, whether it'll be a grand performance or whether it'll just be something discussed on the sidelines. I think there will be actually loud talking about it, and I think if Macron gets up, he'll probably raise that again. And that is something that it's calling the Russians bluff, basically. Talking of calling the Russians bluff, another aspect, of course, is that the F-16 jets, which which the Ukraine has been promised to in its fight with Russia, there is talk that some of them will be based outside Ukraine to make them less vulnerable to Russian airstrikes, and the Russians rather, again, saber-rattling and saying, oh, well, we'll have to attack them too. I mean, that all plays into this idea that is this actually going to become a bigger conflict between Russia and NATO, or is in fact it's just calling Russia's bluff and by sending military trainers, NATO trainers into Ukraine, by keeping planes in Poland, say, or Romania, and then flying them there on missions, what will the Russians do about it? And I don't think the Russians are going to be able to do a great deal about either. even though they will say a lot. So I think that is something that those two issues will be discussed at the weekend.
Well, let's move along, and we have long since passed the point at which it feels like air travel could be made any more tiresome and annoying, but United Airlines may, by golly, have cracked it. They propose to launch their own advertising network, which will target customers via United's mobile app and in-flight entertainment systems with personalised advertising based on data gleaned from a given customer's travel behaviour. The new enterprise is called Connective, i.e. a portmanteau of kinetic and connective, for which alone someone should be punted out of the emergency exit without a parachute. Marta, as a general principle, though, and to try and see this from their side, is targeted advertising actually any less annoying than non-targeted advertising?
The only targeted advertising I want to receive is no advertising. I find targeted advertising, if anything, even more annoying because it has kind of worked out that I'm a woman in my 30s, so everything I get are usually things about babies and pregnancy tests, and that is absolutely not the advertising I want to be seeing.
See, it may just because I am a male in his 50s, but also because I did once make what was the calamitous mistake, which I've regretted ever since, of going online and trying to source a new shed for my garden. Literally all I see on the internet all day, every day, is advertisements for sheds. They have no way of knowing if I've bought one. There just seems to be this assumption by the algorithms that if you look up something once, you're actually going to collect them.
Yeah, I didn't even look for this. This is the interesting thing. It just decided that based on my general characteristics, this is what I'd be looking into. I also watch a lot of neo-fascist music videos for work, so maybe it thought I was a trad wife.
If that's the case, if that's what your algorithm is kind of throwing out there, I think you're actually getting off quite lightly. Stephen, why would anybody, he said, further outing himself as a member of a certain generation, why would anybody even have an airline's app? Why does anybody have anybody's app? I don't understand any of this.
I do have apps. I'm older than you, and I have apps.
Really?
Yes, and there is one.
Do you have any airline apps?
I do. Yes, I'm not going to advertise them.
You're a disappointment.
But, I do. It's very useful. There is a certain airline that you can collect points, and points can be turned into tickets.
Yeah, but you don't need an app.
If you use the app then to do shopping with something else, you actually get lots and lots of these points. I won't name them. I'm not doing an advert because I think this idea of, oh my God, being bombarded either on an app or even worse on the plane. I mean, you're a captive audience. You're sitting there watching one of their films or whatever, and suddenly it's interrupted by saying, buy a garden shed because we know you've been looking for one. But I do find that sort of advertising is really annoying when you look for something that you're not going to buy very often in your life, and then you get bombarded. You have my sympathy there, Andrew.
I mean, I should just say, if anybody in London does know of a reliable shed installer, I am, in fact, actually still looking. But we did want to conclude this conversation by just reflecting on in-flight entertainment and just the worst you can recall. And I will begin with my own tale of woe. This goes back some years, back to when there was only sort of one screen servicing several rows and you had no option about what the in-flight entertainment was. I was spending a lot of time in the United States on several quite long domestic flights, clearly long enough to justify a film. I kid you not, on 5 consecutive flights. It was Legends of the Fall, which sucked the first time and did not improve. Can anybody top that?
I don't think I can, because I came to flying age mostly in an era where in-flight entertainment was pretty decent. I think, though, my first experiences with flying were on low-cost budget airlines, where flights are about 1 hour and a half.
And you bring your own fun.
No, you bring your own fun, but throughout the flight, they are trying to sell you something. Mm-hmm. So you start with the in-flight meal, and then you get the scratch cards, and then you get the charity, and then there's the duty-free. And that is relentless.
Stephen, you travelled a lot at one point on domestic airlines in not merely Russia but the Soviet Union. Was that just like some dude in row 2 with a zipper?
No, it was the first thing you noticed when you got on the plane was the smell of Russian cigarettes.
Amazing.
I mean, it was. You were already back in the USSR when you stepped on the plane, even if you were in London, and then if you're flying around the Soviet Union, also there was always that very distinctive smell. But I think one I sort of kind of tie into this story is because I think that United Airlines could be scoring an own goal here by, actually hacking people off because they don't want to have these personalised adverts. It reminds me of the story of Transaero. And after the breakup of the Soviet Union, of course, in Soviet times, there was Aeroflot. And they used to say, fly with Aeroflot, the airline that never forgets, you have no choice. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they created Transaero. And Transaero, I flew on that internally and internationally a couple of times. And it was sort of okay, it flew and it got you there. But it's no more. And one of the things that did for it was that they put out an advert. So this is so United Airlines, I think, hacking people off with this. And Transaero put out an advert that said, in a survey, we have been judged to be the 10th safest airline in the world, which would probably make most of us find out who the other 9 are and go for them.
I mean, there's a lot of airlines, though, in fairness. 10, that's not bad. I think you're being harsh.
I think they could have said we're in the top 10. I think that would have been perhaps better worded better.
In the top 10 means 10th.
Marta Lorimer and Stephen Dalziel, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, listeners who are or have spent much time in Manchester will be well aware that its citizens require little persuasion that they dwell at the centre of the universe. A new book by the journalist Brian Groom puts a persuasive case that they might be right. Made in Manchester, A People's History of the City That Shaped the Modern World, chronicles Manchester's scarcely calculable influence on industry, politics, music, sport, and more besides. I spoke to Brian earlier. I began by asking how Manchester defined itself apart from its fellow northern powerhouses like Sheffield, Liverpool and Leeds.
Manchester probably does less of the measuring itself against other cities unless it's a football thing. I think it's true to say that Manchester being kind of mostly the largest population and you could say the dominant city region in the north, there is a touch of jealousy among some of the other cities. And though it's been a bit less recently, I think there's been sort of cooperation between leaders of cities quite a bit. So I think it's a bit less than it was. But, not everybody loves Manchester. Manchester has a reputation for, shall we say, arrogance. The swagger, as they used to call it, the old 19th century phrase, what Manchester thinks today, the world thinks tomorrow. Though when I researched that, it was a bit more complicated. It was often in the form, what Lancashire thinks today, the world thinks tomorrow. It's not always as arrogant as it's sometimes seen, though I did come up with a wonderful quote from Anthony Burgess describing the 1920s when he said, for a Mancunian to visit London was an act of condescension.
I mean, you are right that Manchester does have that swagger about it, a confidence which can sometimes seem to verge on belligerence, but you see that reflected as well, I think, in Manchester's music, which there is a chapter in your book on, and any number of great bands have come from Manchester. One thinks most obviously of The Fall, The Smiths, Oasis, Stone Roses, Joy Division, later New Order, and they did all have, in their own way, kind of a belligerence about them.
It did. It's almost a sort of defiance more than confidence, if you get what I mean. Certainly in my youth, which was before all that music scene came along, it was anything but a confident city. It was not on top of the world. It was in terrible decline. And the music scene grew out of that decline and some of the social destruction and urban decay. And that sense of uppityness you get from the music, it's a bit of a sort of sod all this, we can do it, we're proper Manx. And it was a bit more defiance, at least initially, rather than arrogance. It's also, it grew into what I think was a bit of a pose, the whole swagger thing and the proper Manc. It was just part of the scene and part of the image.
Well, the book does have what I think we might think of as a characteristically boastful subtitle, which is The City That Shaped the Modern World. And there you're talking about its emergence as a great, indeed crucial, industrial centre. But is there a simple way to explain why Manchester became that city? Was it about its geography? Was it about its people? Or I rather suspect the answer is going to be all of the above.
I think it's mainly, all of the above, but I think largely geography and geology had a big impact on that. It was in a place that had good supplies of rivers for water power. It was close to supplies of coal and iron. It also had a pre-existing cottage-based textile industry, largely wool and linen and things like that. So it already had a kind of commercial infrastructure. And crucially, it was also not far from Liverpool, where it could import cheap slave-grown cotton and also export its goods. So you put all those factors together, and that's why it kind of grew in the way it did, I think.
Did all of that give it its distinctive political identity, though? Because as your book also points out, this is the city of suffragettes, of Chartism. It's where Marx and Engels did their research for the Communist Manifesto. It's the site of the 1819 Peterloo massacre. And again, I guess it's a chicken and egg thing of, does Manchester shape its politics, or does the politics shape Manchester?
Yeah, I mean, it was the early 19th century was a very turbulent time for various reasons. And everything was changing. And this new phenomenon, the industrial city, you have to remember, nobody at this time knew whether all these changes were going to lead to prosperity or starvation. They just didn't know. It was something they hadn't seen before. That's why people from all over the world were arriving in the city, because they saw it as a kind of template of the future. But it's also quite exciting. So everything, all kinds of things seemed possible. New ideas, new political movements, new technologies. That's partly why those radical movements came along, but they weren't always consistent. They were, along with the what you might call the left-wing radicalism, there was the very successful employer-led campaign for free trade to get rid of the corn laws that were keeping the price of bread high. And free trade, you might say, in some ways is contradictory to some of the other things like Chartism. And also the city's political history is a bit more complicated than people think. Among other things, it had 2 long periods of conservative dominance in the late 19th century and between the 2 world wars in the 20th century. And people often forget that and just think, I mean, it's right that it can be proud of itself and its radical record. It did produce some radical movements, but as I say, it's a more complicated picture.
I mean, your book is obviously a chronicle of extraordinary sort of tumult and upheaval, destruction, renewal, etc. And, this is a city that has changed beyond recognition, not just once, but any number of times. For all that, though, do you think there is anything about Manchester that does stay eternal? Is there something about Manchester which is irreducibly Manchester?
Yes, defining it's probably a bit difficult, and certainly adaptability and being able to sustain itself in the face of very adverse circumstances when its back is against the wall are characteristic. Though I wouldn't like to claim they're unique. I'm sure there are other cities that would claim that in difficult circumstances as well. But I guess it's quite a pragmatic city. Mm-hmm. It's always found ways to emerge out of difficult circumstances and seize whatever things it needs to grow again.
That was Brian Groom, and Made in Manchester is available now. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Marta, Lorimer and Stephen Dalziel. The show was produced by Carlotta Rebello and researched by George Ruskin. Our sound engineer was Lily Austin. I'm Andrew Mueller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.